All right, hello everybody. I want to talk to you a little bit today about run-on sentences. They're also called run-togethers. Uh, it doesn't matter what you call them, they're the same thing. Run-ons, run-togethers, fused sentences, comma splices, all the same thing. Before you watch this video though, I would ask you to, first of all, go to our class. Okay, and actually let me start at home so you can see how to do this. All right, so here's our class on Canvas. Just you can click there or you can click here. Click on the modules. And I'm the teacher, so more modules display than for you. But anyway, you're going to scroll down to Module 7, Grammar, 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 and other things you need to know. And there's a handout here called Having Trouble with Run-On Sentences. Just click on that and please read this handout before you watch this video. All right, so I'm out of here. I bring up run-ons even though you probably heard a lot about them in your freshman comp class. But with the exception of a few students, most students in Essay 1, had at least 2 or 3, and only a few students, to grant credit where it's due, had, terrible, terrible problems with run-ons. But wait, did I just say that wrong? Let me back up. There were a few students who had terrible, terrible problems with run-ons, but most students did not. But they're still a serious problem, and you're a college student, and therefore you should not be writing them. And so here's how to catch and correct run-ons. I pulled these run-ons directly out of essays. Obviously, I'm not saying who wrote them. This is not about class humiliation or anything such as that. But let me give you a little hint about run-ons. First of all, as we know, a run-on is 2 complete sentences. Complete sentences are also known as independent clauses. Independent, they can stand alone as a sentence. All right, so 2 complete sentences run together without a proper demarcation between the 2 sentences. All right, so you can have a fused sentence, which is 2 sentences run together with no punctuation in there anywhere. And you can have a comma splice, which is what most students do. They'll have 2 complete sentences run together with just a little comma in between the 2 complete sentences, and the comma just can't do that job. Well, over the years, I've also learned that part of the problem with identifying run-ons is that sometimes students aren't even sure if a sentence is a sentence, right? So if you're having problems with that, or you're not sure, there's an easy little check that you can do. And I totally stole this from the Writing Center's tutorial on fragments. But anyway, there's a little check that you can do if you're not sure that a sentence is a sentence, and it's called the "Is it true that" check. So all you have to do when in doubt is ask, "Is it true that," and stick the sentence behind that, and if it makes sense as a question, then yeah, it's a sentence. So here are 2 examples. So, is it true that run-ons can be difficult? Does that make sense as a sentence? It does. And yeah, the answer to that question is yes, true. Is it true that run-ons can be difficult? Yes. So that's a clear question that makes sense. And so that is run-ons can be difficult is a sentence. Let's try another one. Is it true that Joyce is a dingbat? Well, that makes sense as a question. The answer to the question is no. But anyway, it makes sense as a question. Is it true that Joyce is a dingbat? Yep, that's a question, a legit question that makes sense. And so, therefore, Joyce is a dingbat is a sentence. All right, I might sound like I'm babbling a little bit, but we'll now apply this check to all of the following, and perhaps you'll see how helpful this really is. All right, here's a sentence from one student's paper. This freedom also, we're talking about Seeley, this freedom also applies to her self-image, comma. She can now define herself rather than be defined. All right, is it true that this freedom also applies to her self-image? Yeah, that makes sense as a question. Is it true that she can now define herself rather than be defined? Yep, that makes sense as a question. So what we have is, one complete sentence followed by another complete sentence. And what we have is just a comma joining them. Therefore, that is an error. So we need to correct it. We'll come back to that in just a minute. All right, here's another example. Shug and Mr. shared children together and wished to marry, comma, however, comma, Mr.'s father did not allow the marriage to happen. All right. Is it true that Shug and Mr. shared children together and wished to marry? Makes sense as a question. Excuse me. My goodness, I'm just getting over this terrible cold that wound up being a sinus infection and blah, 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 blah. Anyway, is it true that Mr.'s father did not allow the marriage to happen? Yes, that's also a question that makes sense. We do have this little word, however, in there, though. So we'll come back to this. Actually, maybe I don't need to do all 5 of these. Perhaps you've got the idea. I'll do one more. As a woman, Seeley didn't even have control of her own body, comma, she was Mr.'s property, comma, an object made to be used. All right, is it true that as a woman, Seeley didn't even have control of her own body? Yep, makes sense as a question. Is it true that she was Mr.'s property? Yeah, makes sense as a question. Is it true that an object made to be used? Well, okay, that doesn't make sense as a question, so clearly this part is not a sentence. Is it true that she was Mr.'s property, an object made to be used? That makes sense as a question. So there's a sentence, and here's a sentence, and it's just joined by this comma. So guess what? We got a run-on. All right, and these other 2 examples are run-ons as well. Let's go back up now and talk about correcting these. Let me take a breath. Probably need to take a hit off my inhaler, but oh well. All right, so this freedom also applies to her self-image. She can now define herself rather than be defined. You can fix this any of a number of ways, as the handout says. You can put a period there. You don't want to do that all the time, because if you did, you'd end up with a paper with a lot of short, choppy sentences. So the student who wrote this has the right idea. The student is trying to write a more a compound sentence, but what we want to do is get rid of the run-on. So FANBOYS is always an option. This freedom also applies to her self-image. She can now define herself rather than be defined. I probably wouldn't use the fanboy here because there's a nice balance. So probably what I would do is use the semicolon right here. Okay? Because that is the perfect fix. This freedom also applies to her self-image. She can now define herself rather than be defined. Yeah, the 2 sides of the sentence are closely related, and that's usually when you've got the best use of the semicolon. All right, next example. Shug and Mr. shared children together and wished to marry. However, Mr.'s father did not allow the marriage to happen. Okay, we just talked about the semicolon, and we've already got this perfectly good conjunctive adverb or transition word, okay, right there. And so the easiest fix, boop, another semicolon. Shug and Mr. shared children together and wished to marry. However, Mister's father did not allow the marriage to happen. Yeah, so just remember that the conjunctive adverbs or the transition words, another way of describing them, are not the same as fanboys. They can't be used with commas. They have to be used with semicolons, but only between two independent clauses. All right, it's a lot to keep straight, but again, I hope I'm just reviewing because you should know this from freshman comp 100 or 105, or its equivalent. Okay, as a woman, Celie didn't even have control of her own body. She was Mister's property, an object made to be used. Okay, here is one that you could fix with a fanboy. We should do that. The one that makes sense here is 4. As a woman, Celie didn't have control of her own body. 4, she was Mister's property, an object made to be used. If you wanted to, you could subordinate that second clause, independent clause, by using a subordinator. As a woman, Celie didn't have control of her own body because she was Mister's property. I actually prefer that fix. It sounds better. The more you do this and the more you make use of all the options that you have available to you, the more your ear will get better and you'll know what is the best fix. All right, let's look at these last two that we never have seen before. All right. This one is about Mister. He had little strength in himself. The only outlet he could see was those around him weaker than him. Whoops, I think I have a typo there. We're weaker than him. All right. This is a fused sentence. There's no punctuation there at all, but there are two sentences. He had little strength in himself. That's a sentence. The only outlet he could see was those around him were weaker than him. All right. Again, these two are closely related, so I might use the sem. Whoops. There we go. Little strength in himself. The only outlet he could see was those around him were weaker than him. Or we could subordinate one of the clauses. Since he had little strength in himself, the only outlet he could see was those around him were weaker than him. Now, let's go back and take our little test. We subordinated one of the offending complete sentences. Is it true that since he had little strength in himself, we added that word there, and now it doesn't make sense as a question. So now we don't have a complete sentence there. All right, so since he had little strength in himself, the only outlet he could see was those around him were weaker than him. And a final example. Sophia is a contrast to Celie. Sophia believes that Celie should be able to fight whoever mistreats her. All right, here's a sentence. Sophia is a contrast to Celie. I think we all see that that's a sentence. And then here's another sentence. Sophia believes that Celie should be able to fight whoever mistreats her. That's also a sentence. We got just a comma there. It's a run-on. Sophia is a contrast to Celie. Sophia believes that Celie should be able to fight. The thing that I would like to do here, Sophia is a contrast to Celie because Sophia believes that Celie should be able to fight whoever mistreats her. Again, what we did was subordinate the second complete sentence and then do the test again. Is it true that because Sophia believes that Celie should be able to fight whoever mistreats her? You see, it doesn't make sense as a sentence. So we've got several different fixes. You can, of course, put a period there. Sophia is a contrast to Celie, period. Sophia believes. You don't want to do that a lot. Sophia is a contrast to Celie. One of the fanboys that makes sense for Sophia believes that. Or we could subordinate one of the clauses, or we could use a semicolon. But make sure that when you use any of those fixes, you check and make sure both sides of the sentence actually happen to be an independent clause. Well, I'm talking a little bit fast here because the longer these get, the more days it takes for me to upload. So I hope this is helpful. If not, please feel free to ask me any questions. And also, there's always the Writing Center at College of San Mateo. They can spend a lot more time with you than I can in a simple video. And no, I don't want to save that. And yes, check Module 8 because the CSM Writing Center also offers you a little bit of extra credit. And I will be speaking with you all again soon, I'm sure. Have a great day.